I got a phone call from my closest friend at work telling me that someone I had professionally destroyed was gone. Not fired. Not disgraced. Gone. And the first thing I felt before the guilt, before the grief, before any of it, was nothing. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you something in you has already made peace with something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. But to understand how we got here, I need to take you back to where this all started. This story, as urgently shared on Reddit, is told entirely from one person's perspective. I work in software support for a large technology company. Have for over a decade now. I am based in the UK, part of a global team, roughly 30 of us spread across different time zones, different continents, different lives. And I want you to understand something before I go any further. I did not walk into this job green. I had 7 years of industry experience before I ever logged my first ticket there. I knew the technology. I knew the work. What I did not know, what nobody warned me about, was him. His name was Shane. Now, I need you to actually picture Shane. Because if I just tell you he was the villain, you will never feel this story the way I need you to feel it. Shane was not some bitter, shuffling office cliché. He was sharp. He was funny in the dry, effortless way that only people who have been somewhere a very long time manage to be. He had been with the company for nearly 40 years. 40 years. The man had institutional knowledge the way old buildings have load-bearing walls, quietly structural, invisible until you tried to remove it. Everyone on the team described him the same way. He's the only person to go to when you're truly stuck. And for a while, honestly, for a good while, I believed them completely. He helped me in those early months. Patient, generous with his time, never made me feel small for not knowing something. I genuinely liked him. I want you to remember that part, because that is what makes everything that comes later hit the way it does. I trusted him. Not professionally. Actually trusted him, the way you trust someone who has never given you a single reason not to. My closest friend on the team was a woman I will call Mel. Similar age to Shane. Similar experience level, but she had never positioned herself as indispensable the way he had. She just did her job, brilliantly, quietly, without needing anyone to notice. She was the person who covered for me during the worst stretch of my first year and never once brought it up afterward. One evening we were on a call that drifted from work into just talking, the way it sometimes does when you have known someone long enough, and she mentioned she had met Shane in person once. At a tech conference in New York a couple of years back. She paused for just a second before she said it, and I remember noticing that pause, and then she told me he had serious health struggles. Significant ones. He was on oxygen at home, managing a lot of medications, carrying weight that was genuinely dangerous for someone his age. His entire plan, she said, was to hold on long enough to take early retirement and keep his medical benefits intact. I said that sounded reasonable. We talked about something else. I did not think about it again for a long time. Here is where it gets interesting. About 2 years into my time there, the company shifted direction. New software, new stack, new everything. We were all trained on it simultaneously. Nobody had a head start. Nobody had an advantage. For the first time since I had joined, the playing field was completely flat. And I want to be honest with you about something. I saw that and I ran at it. I put in hours that had nothing to do with my job description. I stayed late on calls I was not required to join. I read documentation that nobody asked me to read. Not because I was trying to take anything from anyone. Because I genuinely love the work. That is the only reason. Shane, meanwhile, stayed where he was. The legacy tools, the old systems, the familiar territory. I noticed it, but I did not say anything. I assumed it was preference. I assumed he had earned the right to focus where he was most comfortable. I was wrong about what it meant. The comments started small, almost casual. If I joined a meeting a few minutes late because a customer call had run long, which happened to everyone regularly, he would interrupt whatever was being discussed to say something like, "Oh good, glad you finally found the time to join us," with a smile. Always with a smile. Just light enough that calling it out made you look paranoid. Just pointed enough that everyone in the room heard exactly what he meant. Email chains were worse. Any message I sent that included both him and our manager, he would reply with something completely unrelated. A complaint about a process. A vague observation that implied I had missed something. Nothing you could hold directly. Nothing you could bring to anyone without sounding petty. He was very, very good at this. I asked Mel one day, genuinely confused, what I had done. She said she would find out what she could. A few weeks passed. She came back to me with nothing conclusive. Just a feeling. Just something off underneath the surface. Then came the incident that changed everything. A major outage. The kind that puts the entire company on a single call of over 100 people. Senior management, directors, people I had never spoken to in my life. Our manager split us into response teams and she paired me with Shane. I did not love it, but I was professional. We got on a call together and started working through it. Within 15 minutes I knew the real problem. Not a rumor of a problem. Not a hypothesis. The actual root cause, sitting inside a recent patch, buried in the logs exactly where I had learned to look for it. I found it methodically, explained every step aloud as I went because that is how I work. I narrate my process. I always have, and the whole time Shane was silent. He did not know the new system. At all. Not even the basics. Every question I asked him required me to stop, back up, and walk him through the most fundamental steps. I was not condescending about it. I just kept moving. Eventually I shared my screen and said, just watch, I'll talk you through what I'm seeing. I identified the fix. I explained it to him. I told him we needed senior manager approval before rolling anything back, which was standard protocol, which he absolutely knew. And then his name dropped off the call. Skype glitch, I thought. It happened all the time. I rejoined the main call to report my findings. I was not on that call for 30 seconds before they came for me. The incident manager told me, in front of over 100 people, that I had caused the outage through an error in my deployment process, that Shane had identified the fix, that I had refused to implement it, that I had delayed resolution and put the company at serious financial risk. I sat completely still. I did not say a word for a moment that felt like it lasted a year, because I understood exactly what had happened. Shane had left our call the second I told him the fix. He had gone straight back to the group. He had taken everything I found, everything I explained to him step by step on my own shared screen, and handed it to a room full of senior leadership as his own, while painting me as the reckless kid who had caused the problem in the first place. The verbal warning came through in writing 3 days later. His commendation came through the same week. I did not explode. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a moment like this to produce fire. It did not. It produced something much colder and much more patient than fire. I went quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had given up. The quiet of someone who had just decided, very deliberately, what they were going to do next. I kept doing my job. I kept showing up to every meeting, answering every call, logging every ticket. I was polite to Shane on every shared thread. I gave him nothing to point at, nothing to use. I was going to be completely invisible until I was not. Mel called me a few days later. I could tell from her voice that she had something. She told me that Shane had been talking openly, to her specifically about what happened. Not confessing, bragging. He had used the phrase putting that smartass punk in his place, and he had said it with the easy satisfaction of a man who had absolutely no doubt in his own impunity. Mel was shaken. She asked him what he meant, and he had been just vague enough to not say anything incriminating directly. She told me she wished she had recorded the call. Then she laughed and said it would not have mattered anyway. Skype shows a notification when you start recording, and he never would have kept talking if he had seen it. And that was when it landed. She did not know she had just handed me the exact thing I needed. She was venting. She was commiserating. She had no idea that what she just said was the blueprint. Now, stay with me here, because this next part requires you to understand one specific thing about how I was thinking at this point. I was not angry anymore. Anger had burned off in the first 48 hours. What I had now was something more like geometry. A problem with a solution. I could see the shape of it clearly and I just needed to build it carefully enough that it held. The plan was simple. Almost embarrassingly simple. I was going to call Shane directly. I was going to tell him I was recording because the notification would appear. He would see it, and he would perform. He would be careful, measured, probably even apologetic. And that recording would mean nothing. That was not the point. The point was what happened after I turned the recording off. I reached out to Shane on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Just a ping. "Hey, do you have a few minutes to talk?" He replied quickly. Of course, anytime. That ease, that casual confidence, that was the tell. He genuinely believed there was nothing I could do to him. I called him. The moment the recording notification went live on his screen, I watched him shift even over audio you can hear when someone straightens up. I laid it out plainly. I told him I knew he had misrepresented what happened during the incident. I told him it seemed like he had a real problem with me and I wanted to understand why. His response was perfectly measured, calm, slightly wounded even. "I'm sorry you feel like you need to react this way. I think we should probably loop our manager in." And that is when I said the words that changed everything. "Hold on 1 second." I turned off the recording. I watched the notification disappear from his screen. And then I said, quietly, "Skype's not recording anymore. And you and I both know exactly what you did." The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. Then his voice changed. "Hey, before we go any further, if this story is landing the way I think it is, a subscribe genuinely means everything on a channel this size. Okay, back to it. Because it is about to get so much worse. What came out of Shane in those next few minutes was not the explosion of someone caught off guard. It was something almost worse than that. It was the calm, settled grievance of a man who had been nursing a very specific resentment for a very long time and finally had an audience for it. He said I needed to learn to respect the people who had been doing this work since before I was old enough to understand it. He said that when you have put in the years, you have earned the right to not have some newcomer arrive and start reshaping the landscape around you. He said, and I want you to really hear this, that he was a couple of years from retirement. And he would be damned if he was going to break his back learning a new system just to keep pace with someone who had been there for a fraction of the time he had. He said he would do it again. I let him finish. I did not interrupt once. And then I said, very quietly, "Have you ever heard of OBS?" He hadn't. I told him to look it up. Then I ended the call. OBS is free, open source recording software. It records your screen locally, silently, with no notifications, no pop-ups, no warnings visible to anyone else on the call. I had been running it the entire time. Both halves of that conversation, a careful, managed performance while he thought he was being recorded by Skype, and then guarded. Honest confession, once he believed the recording had stopped, were captured completely, cleanly, with perfect audio. I sat with the files for 3 days before I did anything. That was my moment of genuine doubt. And I need to be honest about it. I sat with them, and I thought about Mel telling me he was on oxygen at home. I thought about his retirement package. I thought about the fact that whatever else he was an old man who was sick and scared, and trying to hold on to the one thing that was keeping him financially above water. I thought about all of it. I sat with it for 3 days. And then I thought about the verbal warning sitting in my personnel file. I thought about a room full of 100 people watching me get dismantled in real time for something I did not do. I thought about him saying I would do it again in a heartbeat, not as anger, not as a slip, but as a simple statement of fact. He would do it again. He had told me so himself. I made my decision quietly. No fanfare, no satisfaction. I simply opened my email and attached both files. The company investigation took a few weeks. I was not involved in most of it. They pulled call logs, reviewed the incident timeline, cross-referenced the technical records from that day. The recordings were damning enough on their own, but what made them definitive was that the technical evidence aligned perfectly with everything I had said from the beginning. The patch logs showed exactly when I had identified the problem. The screen share metadata confirmed I had been the one walking through the system. The timeline made it physically impossible for the sequence of events Shane had described to the incident call to have occurred the way he said it did. He had not just lied. He had constructed a very specific lie that required everyone in that room to believe I was both incompetent and insubordinate simultaneously. And the recordings showed him, in his own words, explaining exactly why. I was not in the room when they told him. I do not know how he looked or what he said. What I know is that a few days after the investigation concluded, I received a formal apology from the company, and the verbal warning was removed from my file entirely. And then, about 2 weeks after that, Shane was gone. Mel called me the evening after it happened. She did not say much. She told me he had asked to negotiate an early retirement arrangement to keep his benefits, leave quietly. No further action. The company had said no. I did not know at the time what that decision meant for him practically. I found out later. The debts, the medical costs he had been counting on his package to cover, the position he was in, health-wise, that made re-employment not just difficult but genuinely impossible. His skills had narrowed so completely over the last decade that there was nothing transferable, nothing current, nothing that would get him hired somewhere else at the level he needed. He passed away about 6 months later. His health had been deteriorating for a long time, and without the financial stability to cover his treatment, the decline came faster than it might have otherwise. Mel told me gently. She was not blaming me. She just thought I should know. I did not say much on that call. I thanked her and we hung up, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time afterward. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I think it would be easy to turn this into a clean story with a clean ending, and I do not think that would be fair to what it actually was. There was no triumph in what I felt. There was no closure in the cinematic sense. There was something more complicated than either of those things, the specific weight of knowing that a decision you made set something in motion that you could not stop once it started moving. Did I cause what happened to him? I have turned that question over more times than I can count. The honest answer is that I caused him to lose his job. What happened after that was the accumulated consequence of 40 years of choices he had made, the skills he had allowed to stagnate, the debts he had accumulated, the way he had structured his entire future on a safety net that required him to behave in ways he ultimately could not manage. I did not create any of those conditions. I just removed the one thing that was keeping all of them from collapsing at once. That is not a comfortable thought. I am not trying to make it comfortable. What I can tell you is this. I am still at that company. I have been there over a decade now, and I genuinely love the work. And there is something that changed in me after all of this that I did not expect. I became almost obsessive about the way I treat new people. Anyone who joins the team and is trying to find their footing, I remember exactly what that felt like. I remember what it felt like to be learning something new and have the person who should have been helping you quietly trying to bury you instead. I think about that every single time. If something good came from any of this, that is where I would put it. Not in the justice, not in the recordings, not in any of the mechanics of what I did. In the small daily choice to not become the version of the story where I am the one making it harder for someone else to grow. Because here is the thing about people like Shane, and I say this without pleasure, without cruelty, with nothing but the clarity that only distance gives you. He was not a monster. He was a frightened person who had stopped moving and convinced himself that the only way to survive was to make sure everyone around him stopped moving too. That is not evil. That is just a very particular kind of sad. The recording did not destroy him. He had been building the conditions for his own destruction for years before I ever walked through the door. I just happened to be in the room when it finally finished.